So now it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Joyce, Minister of Finance and Infrastructure, to address us, which is the first working session of this conference. Minister, please.
Well, kia ora, everyone. Good morning, welcome. It's great to have the opportunity to say a few words in front of you. Can I acknowledge our international guests firstly? Welcome to you to New Zealand, particularly for those of you who, like us, share what could be described as a seismically active environment. We move things around a bit seismically. As I know, it happens in Chile. I visited Chile a couple of times. We live, many of us, on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So we've got some Japanese visitors, some Chinese visitors as well. And it's something that we deal with, this management of seismic events, which turn up, as His Worship the Mayor noted, at rather unscheduled times. So can I acknowledge Justin, the Mayor of Wellington, who I got to know quite rapidly through the last earthquake sequence. Also Sarah Stuart-Black, the Director of Civil Defence. Peter, acknowledge you as the President of the Earthquake Engineering Society, and all the delegates here this morning. I was thinking about the speech. This, by the way, is an interesting day for me because at lunchtime I'm giving my pre-budget speech for 2017. The budget is on May 25th. So this is my pre-budget speech. So the trick with this morning is to warm up adequately, but not to make a speech that would otherwise detract from the speech I'm doing at lunchtime. So that's the challenge that my office has set for me this morning. I thought I'd make a few comments in a number of areas. Firstly, I see from the government's perspective 4 or 5 key things that we do in response to the fact of New Zealand's seismic activity. Firstly, I think it's really important that we operate a strong economy in this country, and an economy which has the ability to respond to shocks, whether they be economic shocks or natural disasters. When you're a small country in a geologically young environment, you have to be able to do that. And we have seen that, sadly, a couple of times recently, firstly with the Christchurch earthquakes and then with the Kaikoura earthquakes. So that part's really important, and I thought I'd cover off a little bit of that. Secondly, and related to that, we have to have a strong investment in public infrastructure, because it's the public infrastructure that often people turn to, the bit that people take for granted, which ends up being either there or indicating its worth by its absence in an earthquake event. Thirdly, we have a role in investing in the research, and I know a number of the people in this room will be familiar with the investments made in earthquake science and resilience when I was Minister of Science and Innovation, through GNS, but also through, I see Canterbury University represented here, the Quake Corps, and we have 2 national science challenges in this area, one around buildings and one around resilience. And that's important. Fourthly is the regulatory environment. I'll touch on that briefly. And fifthly, and often most importantly, the immediate response. In terms of economic activity, I can't underplay the importance of that. We're talking about, this morning and today, a lot about buildings. Buildings are built by organisations and individuals. They're maintained or not maintained according to the economic activity that those individuals experience. And so for a country like New Zealand, it is important we have strong levels of economic activity, so that if we come to a situation where we're modernising building stock or we're investing in upgrading, as has been happening in this city in recent times, that building owners have the ability and the resources to make those investments. And sometimes it looks challenging to be able to make those investments, but imagine how much more challenging it would be if your building owners were looking at declining returns, declining economic returns, declining incomes, and also trying to make those investments. So I think the first part from a government perspective is to make sure, as much as humanly possible, that you have a strong and growing economy. And in New Zealand we do have that. We have had one of the fastest growing economies since the global financial crisis, particularly in the developed world. Last year we were the 5th fastest growing country in the OECD. That's not our accustomed position, by the way. We're normally used to growing a bit slower than that. But we have a strong economic plan, we have some wonderful businesses, and they are growing rapidly. And that is giving us job growth, income growth. It's also giving us a lower debt of what we owe as a country to the world, big significant increases in employment, and all of that is flowing through to the increasing prosperity of New Zealanders as a group and across our cities. We're also seeing it in regional New Zealand. We had an interesting discussion in the last few years about the need to upgrade building stock in some of our smaller regional centres. And at the time, those centres were still experiencing the after effects of the global financial crisis. And many building owners were looking at those buildings and saying, I just can't afford to do these upgrades. And fortunately now, in many of those centres, not all of them, but many of those centres, we're now seeing levels of economic activity which is justifying not just upgrading buildings, but investing and modernising and adding to them for the future. The second part of the economic story is that ability to respond economically when a major event occurs. And that's part of my definition of resilience. Because we all know about resilient buildings, it's important to have resilient buildings, resilient infrastructure, resilient communities. But actually you need a resilient country as well. You need a country that has the ability to step up and support a community when a natural disaster occurs. To give you a bit of an indication of that, when we had both the global financial crisis followed by the Canterbury earthquakes 2 years later, those were two really big knocks to the New Zealand economy. Both of them have significant impacts on GDP. Nearly every country experienced the global financial crisis, but New Zealand also had the Canterbury earthquakes. And the government chose to handle that by supporting those communities, rebuilding Christchurch, but also supporting the vulnerable people in particular through the global financial crisis by maintaining income support and so on, which was great. But as a result, we borrowed the equivalent of 20% of our GDP. We went from around 8% of net debt to 28% of net debt over about a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. And the best thing about that was we had the ability to do it. Because what we were able to do was make those commitments, not set up extra taxes or cut entitlements, which was able to then encourage the economy to grow. And a strong and growing economy, as I said earlier, that's the thing that actually really helps you there. But importantly, we had that capacity. So now we're very focused on getting net debt back down again as a percentage of GDP. So we're targeting to get to 20% by 2020. And then we'll target something else after that, which I'll talk more about today. And that's really important because at a country level, that's the resilience that allows us to stand behind a Christchurch or a Kaikoura or wherever it happens next. And we know it will happen. Just as the Japanese know, just as the Chileans and the Peruvians and the Chinese know, there will be more earthquakes in these islands. And the challenge is, will we be ready to respond to them? Public infrastructure, of course, is part of our role as well, making sure public infrastructure is strong and resilient. I went to Christchurch as Minister of Transport just after the first Christchurch earthquake. And because I was the Minister of Transport, I got taken around all the highways and railways. And the engineers took me around those bridges and overbridges and so on. And I have to say it was slightly disconcerting as I went round because there was this sort of slightly delirious, happy demeanour on behalf of some of these engineers. And I was trying to get my head around that because it seemed like a pretty tough event. And what they were showing was that they had all their structures had survived the earthquakes and actually stayed intact. And one of them said to me, we design for this stuff, over a 40 or 50 year lifetime of a structure, but we never expect to see whether our designs worked or not. And I said, well, I'm very happy for you that they worked. I sort of know where he was coming from, but still it was slightly weird. But that public infrastructure is important, and it's important also diversity of public infrastructure. I think of this city, which I know pretty well, and again, while I was Minister of Transport, we were discussing the northern corridor out of the city. And I was taken out early on to have a look at the potential of Transmission Gully versus an upgrade of the coastal route, and also what was going to happen through Kapiti, Otaki and so on, which is the main highway north for those of you that aren't from here. And I was of a mind as I went on that trip that perhaps an upgrade of the coastal route out of Wellington might be a more cost-effective way of preparing a further corridor for the city north. But I was very rapidly convinced as we flew over Transmission Gully versus the coastal route that actually, for resilience reasons alone, we had to have an alternative corridor north up through that gully as an alternative to the coastal route. And it is actually really important. All you've got to do is look at State Highway 1 north and south of Kaikoura now and know what could happen north of Pukirua Bay to understand that that is really important. Not that you can ever guarantee that no corridor will be affected, but what you can hopefully get is you build that resilience and alternative routes for this, our biggest city in the lower North Island, to be able to maintain lifelines following a major event. And there's plenty of other examples of that. And I think one of the things that is happening now is councils are looking very carefully at their infrastructure in light of the recent events in Kaikoura, which affected Wellington here, and also in Christchurch. I'll make a prediction actually. My view is that councils will probably spend more time investing in their core infrastructure, like water and roads, over the next 5 or 10 years than they have in the last 5 or 10 years. One, for expansion as New Zealand grows, but two, because the public are now more demanding, and rightly so, of that core basic infrastructure. They've seen what happens when some of it disappears, and they'll want to know from their councils, with support from government, that those very important pieces of infrastructure are being invested in. So the importance of economic activity, public infrastructure, the research environment I've spoken about, regulatory settings, very important. One of the challenges in the New Zealand environment is we had a very small agency, Department of Building and Housing, that was responsible for our building regulations. And what we decided to do was move that into the centre of government, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, so there was a larger organisation that could respond and put more resources into this regulatory space. I'm pleased to see they're sponsoring this conference today. It's that sort of working with sectors that will give them a far better insight into that regulatory environment. And finally, the importance of response. And that is important, the immediate response. Sadly, when the Kaikoura earthquakes happened, and Sarah will understand what I'm about to say, sadly, what we had to do was then all too familiar. When the first earthquake happened in Christchurch in 2010 and then the big one in 2011, a lot of what we were doing was having to relearn things that had been forgotten institutionally 30 or 40 years ago. And we had to relearn them for Christchurch. And then, of course, Kaikoura happened, and we were very familiar with what would be required around business support, around getting resources quickly to those areas, around health, mental health support and so on. And we were able to come up with a very strong list of the things that needed to be done. That's not what you'd wish on anybody, but what I am hoping is that with the current civil defence review that's been instigated by Minister Brownlee, that we will be in position to learn strongly from our recent experience. I think also, though, it's really important that countries in this region continue to learn from each other's experience, because thankfully we don't have these events too often. But collectively, as an Asia-Pacific region, we do have this number of events quite often. So I have argued strongly, and will continue to argue strongly, for more of our scientific organisations and our governmental organisations to work much more closely across the Asia-Pacific region in terms of learning, applying and learning again from seismic events, as well as, of course, helping each other when we need it. And we thank all the countries represented here that helped in particular during Christchurch, which of course was a very difficult event, and we had to call on response teams from all over the world. It's an important subject and it's a sobering subject. But it's part of our lives. This country, as I said, is a geologically young, seismically active country. It is also a very beautiful country. And the challenge is to make sure that as much as possible we mitigate the risks of living here while ensuring that we enjoy the opportunities of living here. And that, in a way, is what your conference is about today. So can I thank you very, very much for having me here. This sort of work is absolutely top of mind with this government, and we will keep it top of mind as we head not just into Budget 17, but also beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for a very insightful talk, and I think a good basis for us to move forward in looking at earthquake resilience. It is a team effort. It's a team with government, with the industry and all the players, and it's only by being a team that we actually will make New Zealand more resilient. We thank you for your words and attendance at the conference today, and we hope we can deliver.
Very good.
It's now my pleasure to ask Bruce Pepperell, the Regional Manager for the Wellington Emergency Management Office, to address.
Sorry, just working out how the machinery works. Your Worship, Minister, Sarah, chairs, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences during the Kaikoura earthquake, and I'm also going to have a consistent theme right the way through, and that's of the need for situational awareness, great situational awareness. Now, sometimes it's really important when you're trying to make a point to actually use an example from outside your sector. So, as an ex-military person, I just want to take you through a little battle campaign here. Please bear with me, but I think you'll understand. I'm a naval officer, but I thought I'd choose that one there. The names had some ring of authenticity. So, Wellington, Waterloo, okay, 3 battles in 4 days. And what I'm going to try and do is give you a 2-minute explanation. It won't do the battle justice, but here goes. Right, Napoleon escapes from Elba, lands in southern France, marches on Paris. All the military say to the king, "Oh, thanks very much, it's been nice knowing you, but we're with Napoleon." He marches north, where there are 2 armies waiting for them, one Anglo-Dutch and the other one Prussian. Now, Napoleon knows that in order to be successful, he can't take on both those. He's got to defeat them one-on-one. So he arrives in theatre, and somebody goes and tells the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon's here. And his reaction was, "Bullshit, my spies tell me he's still in Paris." So, first mistake, situational awareness, poor, but not fatal. Okay? Napoleon turns to his right flank, attacks the Prussians, mauls them badly. They withdraw. As they withdraw, he peels off some of his forces, and tells them to keep between him and the Prussians so that they can't rejoin the fight. Okay, so 30,000 peel off to chase the Prussians. What they do is they engage them the whole time, but while he's engaging the Prussians in the rear, what the general doesn't realise is that they've actually circled back round, and 2 days later they rejoin the conflict. So situational awareness poor, this time fatal. Okay, in the meantime, Napoleon's moved on the crossroads. Wellington finally comes to an understanding that actually this is indeed Napoleon and he's here to do battle. But for 2 days he doesn't do anything all that much. And the reason for that is he's trying to understand what the hell's going on, because if he's actually drawn into a battle to his left, over in the east, then he thinks that Napoleon's actually going to go to his left and encircle him and stop him, his supply routes out to the sea and also his exit. So he waits to figure out what's happening there. So anyway, he finally comes to his senses and realises, look, this is the real battle here, it's right in front of me, so he engages a day too late. Situational awareness poor, but not fatal. Okay, they slug it out. Napoleon attacks him on the right. It's a feint, trying to draw forward the Duke of Wellington's reserves. He doesn't draw them forward because the main attack is off to the left. So situational awareness, good. They're managing to hang in there. So they fight themselves to a standstill. Wellington withdraws, and then comes the last battle. What Wellington's trying to do is draw them into a battle up the centre of the hill. Napoleon wishes to attack him on the hill. They have this battle. They come to a standstill. And what happens is Blücher, the Prussian, comes round and attacks him in the flank. So what I'm trying to say, and it's probably a very complicated way of doing it, is situational awareness is absolutely important. Sometimes the lack of a situational awareness will not be fatal, other times it'll be absolutely fatal. And here lies the challenge that we experienced some 201 years later when we had our 3 top hazards hit us in 4 days. I want to talk to you a little bit about it, okay? The earthquake, 2 minutes past 12, we all roll out of bed. My first reaction was, and the GNet said it was a 6.5, and my first thought was, gosh, it felt a lot closer than that. And the reason for that was because it wasn't, and as you can see from the slide there, situational awareness, as it strengthened, the earthquake grew in magnitude, okay? But it wasn't till 3 days later that we found out it was a 7.8. And it's a hell of a lot different trying to combat a 7.8 than a 6.5. But once again, bad situational awareness on our part, but not fatal. And the reason for that situational awareness, okay, the scientists tell us it was probably the most complex emergency ever, maybe on the planet. And so as a result, they've had to rewrite all their models. So sometimes situational awareness is not with you, but that's just the way it is. And there was nothing that we could have done to actually avoid that. Tsunami. One of the first things I've got to do when I get out of bed is to determine whether or not there's a tsunami, because I can't afford to wait 20 to 30 minutes as I drive into the office. Now, what really shocked me later on when I went back to check my time frame is I didn't actually leave home for 30 minutes. But in that time I made 18 phone calls and satisfied myself that there was no tsunami associated with that, went into the office. And of course, largely an hour later, the situation changed. Situational context was there was in fact a tsunami, but there wasn't any context associated with that. And it wasn't until I actually spoke to the scientists concerned that he confirmed that there was in fact a rupture offshore. When all the other reports had been that there was a rupture, they were all onshore. So that was a gigantic oh shit moment where we'd lost an hour, potentially fatal, But we sat down and tried to work out what the impact would be. And in our own team, we came up with the fact that it was a red zone impact. It would only affect the beaches, the coastal regions and the estuaries. And so we put out a messaging associated with that. Half an hour later, we got the message from the tsunami panel that said for Wellington it could be anything from a 1 metre to a 3 metre tsunami. That was the next oh shit moment, which caused us to reconsider what we'd originally planned. We went through all the tide gauges and we came to the conclusion, no, it was definitely a 1 metre tsunami, and we put our messages out. However, in the meantime, there are independent media outlets out there who were going for leather, and they freaked out all the population of Kapiti and half the ones of Petone as well. People were climbing hills several hundred feet up. Now, if the tsunami was going to get them there, it would have been one of biblical proportions. But anyway, that was the situation that we were dealing with first thing in the morning. So let's move on to one of the other factors here, was the weather. That morning we were dealing with 140k winds. So when the tsunami hit and all the rubble started coming off the facade damage and we had broken windows, it was getting whipped up. Nobody actually wanted to deal with it, and fair enough. Safety of public and response people was absolutely paramount. Monday night, we had a warning of rain on the Tararuas, but for us it doesn't mean very much. And it wasn't until the following morning at 6:19 that we were told there was going to be heavy rainfall in Wellington. And so what resulted there was the whole place got cut off. We lost our rail networks because of the earthquakes. We lost all major highways out of the region because of the weather, flooding. All the intermediary roads were knocked out. It was quite something to try and create some order out of that chaos there. But that wasn't all, okay? Now, we have people joke about, okay, what about the plague of locusts and all that sort of thing, but in actual fact, we had a swarm of bees. Absolutely amazing. I don't know where they came from, but they covered 2 cars in Lower Hutt. We had tornadoes, king tides, bomb scares, traffic accidents, road closures, floods, rain, gales, absolutely everything. If somebody had written an exercise scenario that says you were going to get all that in the space of 24 hours, I would have said bullshit, but that's what we had. So let's look at the response, okay? Public safety, number one. Absolutely paramount, but there are some other very important considerations there. We were interested in preserving the social and economic well-being of our people. So trying to manage that, what we have to do is manage it vertically, so you have the national response, you have the regional response, and you have the local response. We were also trying to manage it horizontally. So we had a coordination centre and we had 5 emergency operations centres. We had 300 people going hell for leather, trying to actually create some order there. We had the regional transport response team because there was no transport going anywhere. Cities like Pororua, you couldn't get one from one side of the city to the other. We had engineers. It was a very fine line trying to balance public safety and preserving economic and social well-being. We were also intensively trying to manage the whole situation, being agile and making sure that everybody had sufficient information. That's how we were structured there. So it was very complex, the response, but we were dealing with a very complex situation. So let's have a look in Wellington, okay? 2 minutes past midnight, most of us had an hour's sleep, prolonged period of shaking. If I'd lived next to the sea, I would have evacuated right there and then. It was that strong, okay? Come into the office trying to understand, gain situational awareness. We were behind the 8 ball. We knew there would be some damage to buildings. We quickly had to transition to tsunami mode, okay? That took several hours to actually sort that out and make sure that there was no threat to the population. We then had to resume building focus. It's still dark now, okay? There was a need to decide whether to declare. I'm going to talk a bit about that later on. And we had to provide advice to the public. What do you do? They're going to wake up shortly, those who actually slept right through. Should they be coming into work as normal? And the answer was no. Now, I've gotten away in the past by telling everybody not to come into work, and that's exactly what I did that day. Come daylight, we commenced rapid impact assessments. We then initiated the rapid building assessments, and we put the onus on building owners and employers. Employers have a duty of care to their people. Building owners have a duty of those people in around their buildings. Some buildings posed a risk to public and inhabitants, and what we took, we worked really intensively to try and cordon off those areas. So we established some cordons. We knew there were structural failures in the port area. And later that day, there was a decision on whether it was okay to come back in the CBD. Now, we carried out our rapid impact assessment. We had a number of reports from building owners, and we thought we'd actually contained all the damage areas. Now, you've got to be very careful about telling people not to go to work and their livelihood if indeed there's nothing to stop them doing that. And so we made the decision to allow people to access the CBD, and I'll explain why, but we did it under certain circumstances. We said as long as you stay out of the cordon areas and as long as your employer has told you it's safe to go back into a building. And from there, we intensively managed the situation, being flexible enough to be able to move at very short notice to change the situation. Talking about keeping a damaged city running, okay? We didn't make a declaration here. We thought about it several times, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why we thought it wouldn't add the value that we required. What we did have waiting in the wings was some very useful legislation that had just been passed but hadn't actually been enacted in terms of the Civil Defence Emergency Management Amendment Bill dealing with recovery. That turned out to be an absolute godsend in the end. So there were a number of questions. Why no damage to earthquake-prone buildings? I mean, we'd been through the situation in 2013. We'd stickered a whole lot of buildings, and yet all those ones which were rated earthquake-prone, they were all standing high and proud, not a scratch on them. There was didn't you learn from Christchurch? And the answer was, yes, we did, but this wasn't Christchurch. I mean, what happened in Christchurch, certainly in the second earthquake, the buildings fell down, they cordoned around it, and the rest of the place was relatively safe. We never actually had that epicentre of damage, and I'll explain to that later on. There was the question of what constitutes safe, because there's no such thing as something of safety in absolute terms. It's all about risk and opportunity. You know, I can't guarantee that it's safe to cross the road across there. I know that there'll be 300 to 400 people killed on our roads, but we don't stop people using those roads. The other consideration was, are our building codes adequate? You know, they're designed for safety, but are they designed for recovery? Is that important? And I'm going to talk a little bit about later on, because yes, it is important. Because for the city here, okay, if there's no injuries to people, well, that's wonderful. But if you can't actually use the city, if you can't enter the buildings, if you can't use them for commercial purposes, if there are no commercial purposes, there's no jobs. If there's no jobs, who the hell wants to live in Wellington? And one of the reasons why we had difficulty actually trying to cordon things as far as people's recollection of Christchurch was, that's a picture of Wellington there, okay? There were 2 buildings that we found, and that was on the 3rd day, I think it was, that were a risk to the public, and so there were quite substantial cordons placed around them. The rest of the other buildings, in the early days, we knew they were unoccupied, but we didn't know why. But as it turned out, they were no risk to people around as long as we keep people out of those buildings. So there was no epicentre of damage. There's one building there, there's a group over there, there's another few down there, but nothing that you could actually cordon the whole area. So this was not a big red zone event, it was little tiny red zones. The situation in Wellington is a hell lot different from Christchurch. Our CBD has a perimeter of 9.2 kilometres. Now, if our whole army linked hands, they still couldn't actually patrol that perimeter. And that's just Wellington City alone. That's the region there, or part of the region, okay? Right, there's a building called Queensgate. It's just off to the west of a little suburb called Waterloo. That, in those early days, we knew that was unoccupied, but we knew it was being managed, and by establishing a cordon around that, we knew there was no threat to public safety. I was also interested in what was happening in the other city further north, Porirua, also in Kapiti. I mean, they've got buildings there that were potentially at risk, and they're in peaty, sandy soils. So the challenge for us was there was no epicentre of damage, and therefore it was really difficult trying to manage the situation in the same way that they did Christchurch. A little bit about the Act there. One of the reasons why we didn't declare initially was that the Act, if we declare, I get the powers of a small nation dictator, it'll allow me to require people to give me information, but that's only if they've actually got that information. It doesn't allow me to say you are to go off and do that. In order to do that, I've got to use another section of the Act which says that I may require people to examine property. Now, if I do that for 1,200 buildings in the CBD, and those of you who live in Wellington know that there were quite a few at-risk buildings outside the CBD of Wellington, some up in Lower Hutt, some in other places in Wellington, some in Porirua. I was also interested in Kapiti. Then that's going to be a nightmare to actually manage. So these are the things that went through our minds on the first day. Day two, we had massive access issues across the region, which took a whole day to actually sort out. That took a lot of focus, while part of the team were actually focusing on the building situation. Day three, we observed additional facade damage. So we did the initial impact assessment, and then 3 days later we found some more damage that nobody picked up. And of course that sends alarm bells. You think, my God, have we missed something here? Do we miss it, or did an aftershake actually cause that? We were able to determine from GeoNet recordings that probably the buildings in the 6 to 15 stories had probably received their full design loading. We knew that there were certain structural characteristics that had sustained damage. We established a clearinghouse, and we were awaiting information on the number of important unoccupied facilities. Now the challenge there is, nobody wants to tell a local council what the hell's happening, because as soon as they tell us, it's part of the official record. So actually trying to prise this information out of people. All along, we were continuing our intensively managed, flexible, agile approach. So anything came up, we actually managed it very quickly. Day 4, continuation of that approach. Okay, we commenced the reconciliation of the buildings versus assessments. At the end of, we were activated for 12 days, and at the end of each of those days, I assembled everybody, so local government, police, fire, building people, engineers, scientists, and my question was, have we been too quick to come back in? Do we need to pull back? Do we need to veer left? Do we need to veer right? And after 12 days, we never ever came to a situation where there was an intermediate solution that would better satisfy our need for public safety and economic and social well-being. It was in that second week that, despite our best endeavours and what we were doing, and the building people were doing a great job actually doing the reconciliations, it occurred to me that even when we completed this process, we weren't going to be a lot better off. At the end of the day, we couldn't actually say, put hand on heart and say our buildings are perfectly safe. Perfectly safe for what? And so it was, I wrote to the Mayor and I said, look, we've done the we've done the rapid impact assessment, we've done the rapid buildings assessment, we're doing the reconciliation, but what is actually required is detailed damage evaluations for each of these buildings. And under the recovery legislation that was then pushed through, we were actually able to achieve that, and that resulted in the council writing to 80 building owners, and that's what's going on. So after 12 days, we transitioned the situation to the city recovery team. We'd largely done the reconciliation, and we passed off. And after that, we conducted our own action review, and of course there were a number of articles in the media about aspects of the situation, including that one there. Really interesting article. 11% of our building space unused. Well, what would happen if it was 12% or 20% or 25 or 50%? You imagine the impact that's going to have on not only the city, the region, but the people as well. So the question is, when we design our codes, is the fact that it's not going to fall down and kill anybody sufficient? Or do we actually have to build them so that we can very quickly reuse them later on? Now, that's a real tour de force of what actually happened there. I've tried to use the analogy of, Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington. In that situation back there, they had very poor situational awareness. Some of it was not fatal, but some of it was. And that's why one team won and the other team didn't, basically. But the challenge for us was we had very poor situational awareness. Some of it, there was nothing we could do about it. If it's the most complex set of ruptures that anybody's ever come across, well, that's what it is. But there is things that we can do about it. People say to me, well, Bruce, now that you know what you know now, what would you have decided differently? And the answer is, what a waste of time. Hell, I could have prosecuted the Battle of Waterloo if I was able to operate with 20/20 hindsight. So the real question is, what is it that we need now that will enable us to make better decisions later on? And so when it came to our after-action review, number 6 down there is really important. The others are procedural things that I have in hand. But we need to investigate opportunities to provide real-time data to improve situational awareness. Now, it's really important. We may have our own earthquake, and that would be a terrible thing around here. But if we actually had a very quick understanding of where the risks were and what they were likely to, the consequences were, then we could probably make better decisions rather than trying to restore normality to your region, but trying to do it by braille, intuition, and a bit of luck. The last one down there, building codes, and that's something for you to consider over the next couple of days. There's a lot at stake here, and we were very lucky. The Duke of Wellington said that what happened at Waterloo was the closest call that ever happened to him. He came within a whisker of losing, and what difference would that have made to Europe? Would have had a massive difference. We came within a whisker of having some potentially bad impacts here in Wellington. The fact that, we still have a city, we can still see our buildings there, apart from 3 at the moment, although some still have to come down. It's no consolation the fact that next time we need much better situational awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think you raised some very interesting points. As one of a number of engineers that turned out still in the dark on the Monday morning, the challenge of identifying just what damage has occurred is really difficult. We use car parks as an indicator of damage because they're accessible, but most buildings aren't. And apart from seeing visible damage on the outside, that's one aspect that makes Bruce's job a really challenge. And I think that the Wellington earthquake was a very great success of not having an emergency management, not closing off the city, but making those brave decisions that kept the city operational while taking appropriate care on public safety. So thank you, Bruce. It's now my pleasure to ask Sarah Stuart-Black, Director, Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management, to come and address you.
Good morning, and good morning to those visiting Wellington from around the country, but also those international visitors. I'd like to add my thanks again to the Society and to the chairs for having us here today. It's fair to say it's been a busy year, and today I thought I would talk about the post-14th of November 2016 Kaikoura earthquake and tsunami, and the challenges and opportunities that have come from that. It's fair to say it's been a busy year. We started last year with Exercise Tangaroa, which was New Zealand's largest ever earthquake and tsunami exercise, with hundreds of stakeholders involved from across the country, and followed by 6 emergencies in fairly quick succession. Of those, we've had 2 that have been both earthquakes with tsunami that have followed. So the 7.8 magnitude earthquake just after midnight on the 14th of November, as you've heard, is possibly the most complex earthquake sequence recorded, with 21 faults ruptured, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more of that from GNS. We saw consequences across Huranui, Kaikoura, Marlborough and Wellington, and the earthquake and its aftershocks were widely felt across the country, resulting in land deformation, coastal uplift, 80 to 100,000 landslides, 150 landslide dams, isolation to communities due to eroding damage and landslides, and aftershocks up until January were over 8,000, with 53 above a magnitude 5. Subsequently, NIWA has confirmed that the tsunami that was generated was up to 7 metres at its highest point. Air access was provided from day 1 into Kaikoura, with sea access from day 3, road access with the military only from day 5. We had 26 days in the National Crisis Management Centre, which is in the basement of the Beehive in the Parliamentary Complex. And we know that the support that came from police, fire, defence, government agencies, local government, lifeline utilities, engineers, and a whole range of other stakeholders made a huge difference to the effort in those affected areas, but also here in the National Crisis Management Centre. So what were some of these challenges? I think you've heard a lot of them from Bruce, but one of the issues is the complexity of this event and the challenges that come with not having all of the information available to you at the time. You have to use good judgment, you have to use experience, and you have to be prepared to make those tough calls, some would say brave. The challenge is around the issues to do with the warnings, about the challenge of not understanding that because of the complexity of this emergency, that there was a tsunami generated when this initially appeared to be an on-land earthquake, the size of the earthquake, the depth of the earthquake, and around that set of expectations that in a local source earthquake that generates a tsunami, that there is time for official warnings. Local arrangements were put in place, however, because of regional differences and the way that we have such an instantaneous ability to see information online and through social media, it resulted in inconsistencies in what the public were hearing in terms of information and advice about what they should be doing. Whilst in most coastal areas, local warning mechanisms were triggered, again, and it resulted in evacuations, but again, those differed between different regions. It was great to see self-evacuations and the fact that actually a huge range of people in different communities knew exactly the right action to take, that the earthquake was so big and rolled for longer than a minute that people took that immediate action to evacuate inland or uphill. We know that some of the local radio stations close at night, so there's a lack of local information being provided through those mechanisms. And the dilemma, as I've said, about the fact that earthquakes can generate tsunami, even though they may occur on land, but the rupture may extend out to sea. So what did all this mean? Little public understanding about civil defence emergency management and the devolved accountability of the way that the civil defence emergency management legislation is structured, that local decision making does happen at the local level. That civil defence emergency management is not just one organisation, it's a system. So that's about all of the agencies involved, emergency services, lifeline utilities, local and central government, private sector, public sector, not-for-profit, all working together. And this is a really important element because the ability to have a successful approach relies on that team effort to deliver the functions for our communities. The criticality of public information management and the way that technology and the changing nature of the way that people obtain information, including the 24-hour news cycle, has meant a real hunger for information. I'll give you some quick statistics. On the New Zealand Get Through Facebook page between the 14th and 27th of November, there were 231 posts, and the total reach went to 4.3 million people, with a daily reach of 1.13 million. On the New Zealand Civil Defence Twitter, in that same period, there were 218 tweets with 14.7 million total impressions, with a 13.2 million peak of daily impressions. The website received 221,000 page views in that same period. There is a huge expectation of having to make significant decisions for those in leadership roles without all of the information. And this is about courageous leadership, but it is about good judgment, using your experience and having that confidence in the fact that you may not have all the facts, but you're making the best possible decision on the day with the information that you have available. And as Bruce said, you know, it's an unfair thing to then look back and say, gosh, couldn't you have done that differently? Wouldn't it be nice to have all that information available to you beforehand? There is a really fine balance, and I've talked about this with the media as well, following the 2nd of September earthquake and tsunami off the East Cape, about the perceptions of crying wolf or of getting sufficient warnings out there when there is a real risk. What's become clear is the importance of understanding those natural warning signs is utterly critical. The "if it's long or strong, get gone" message, which has become a real catchphrase on top of the drop, cover and hold for earthquakes, but needing to ensure that the decisions that are being made when we can issue warnings are based on that science advice. The criticality of having that evidence basis is crucial. Questions have been asked about whether the Civil Defence Emergency Management System is fit for purpose, and really asking about what is needed for us to be prepared for any future emergencies. So from here, what are the opportunities and what are we putting into action? Some of the things we're doing have been really practical. So we're trying to reduce some of the grey areas. And by that I mean we have thresholds that we've agreed with GNS for the size and depth of earthquakes, and where we know that due to that science research that a tsunami will have been generated. And below that there's this area of grey where we go to GNS and we ask their advice from the Tsunami Experts Panel to advise us about whether there is that potential risk. What we have done is tried to find a balance between lowering the threshold to make it clearer about where there is a risk, but also making sure that what we don't end up with is a situation where we're seen to issue warnings when in fact there is no risk, and the view of crying wolf or potentially having it so that the public don't believe there is a real risk and so don't take any action. In New Zealand, issuing a warning is a call to action. It's not just to seek information. So there's a real critical element here about understanding, well, what does that mean? So for us, in the discussion with GNS, it has been lowering the threshold to a way that we can be sure that, yes, we've removed some of that grey area, but without having that sense of going too far with it. And we've reduced it down to 7 instead of 7.5, which is actually quite a big jump. It still means that for earthquakes that occur below a 7, that are of a certain depth, we still seek that advice from GNS, and there still will be the need to take time to make those decisions and get that advice. But that's why that importance of understanding those natural warning signs is so important to people making good decisions and knowing that they can evacuate themselves and their families to stay safe. GNS is also working with the Ministry on local source tsunami tool to better look at being able to pinpoint where earthquakes are occurring, and GNS are also looking at 24/7 enhancements to the way that they operate, which we're working closely with them on. To increase efficiency and timeliness to inform decision making and provide public information, aside from that 24/7 looking at enhanced monitoring and assessment by GeoNet, we have also been upgrading the national warning system, and training on the new system begins in May with implementation likely in June. You will have heard the announcements about cell broadcast alerting, and that time frame, which originally was going to be 18 months from the decision to proceed with that, has been brought forward and accelerated. So a number of the parts of that implementation are being done now in parallel rather than in a sequence, and we're aiming to still be in a position for the system to be implemented later this year. I've signed a new memorandum of understanding between the ministry and broadcasters, and that's about the way that we work together when there are emergencies to make sure that public information and public advice is provided in a clear and coherent and consistent way across the media. We also provided an enhanced public education program between December and February, which is actually being rolled out again from late April, which will run through till June. And this was about the clips that you will have perhaps seen on TV. For our international visitors, you might get a chance to see those on TV or online while you're here. But it was to have shareable resources, posters, videos, radios, fact sheets in 22 languages that talked about the drop, cover, hold message, but also the long or strong, get gone message. We've had an incredible reaction to those. Now, in part, that might have been due to the terrible weather we experienced over Christmas and that a lot more people were at home, so therefore had the TV on or were online. But we had almost views of the banners online over 8 million times, with over 12,000 clicks through to the website. On-demand videos were viewed more than 1.1 million times. TV advertising reached 69% of audiences once, and 59% saw it 3 times. Newspaper and advertising reached 850,000 people aged over 18. And that the campaign was supported by many organisations around New Zealand, such as the Department of Internal Affairs, which included leaflet inserts with passports issued in February, which amounted to around 50,000 people. Hospitality New Zealand included resource links in their newsletter to over 1,000 commercial accommodation providers, and the advertising success was considered well above the benchmark for government advertising. The campaign absolutely exceeded our expectations, and this needs to be kept in mind that the campaign was developed from start to finish in 5 weeks, and normally these kinds of campaigns, when they're national, normally take around 6 months. The key here was we were developing some common and simple messages to be used across the country that were augmented by CDM groups locally and being able to provide more contextual information to their communities on the ground. So to enhance the arrangements, we've in the process of updating the National Tsunami Advisory and Warning Plan, and that's to reflect all of the changes that have been discussed with key stakeholders during the time since the earthquake and tsunami. We're refreshing the Wellington Earthquake National Initial Response Plan, which is a most unfortunate abbreviation of the WENERP. The purpose of this initial response plan is to direct and coordinate the immediate national response to a major Wellington earthquake until a formal response structure and specific national action plan has been established. So in effect, this means no decision making is required. A major earthquake is defined as obviously a very large one affecting Wellington that closes road access into the capital and affects or disrupts telecommunications, or where the impact is sufficient to lead the national controller to activate the plan. The other key element has been an increased focus on business continuity, and I think we've seen that play out not just across the public sector, but also the private sector, and a real sense of families wanting to make sure that they are also prepared. As Minister Joyce mentioned, Minister Brownlee announced actually on Sunday that he was establishing a technical advisory group to identify where improvements in New Zealand's civil defence emergency management structure could be made. In March, Minister Brownlee convened a cross-party meeting to initiate discussions about the CDM structure and the shortcomings highlighted by recent emergencies, including the Kaikoura earthquake and tsunami and the Port Hills fires. Cabinet last week approved the Technical Advisory Group and its members, which would include the chairmanship by Roger Sowry, representatives from Local Government New Zealand, New Zealand Police, New Zealand Fire Service, New Zealand Defence Force, myself from the Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management, and also a former Deputy Chief Executive from the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. The first meeting of that technical advisory group will be in the week commencing the 22nd of May, and the Minister is anticipating that that technical advisory group will submit recommendations by the end of August. Subsequent to that, on Monday, the Prime Minister announced changes to ministerial portfolio responsibilities, and so from this coming Tuesday, the Honourable Nathan Guy will become the Minister for Civil Defence, and that means the Technical Advisory Group will provide their recommendations to him. So aside from this experience of the 14th of November last year, the progress made in the last few years across the 4 Rs of risk reduction, readiness, response and recovery has been substantial, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. There has been a real elevation of risk reduction and recovery to become equal partners again with readiness and response. There has been a willingness for leaders to wallow in the discomfort of difficult conversations about actually what does the future look like for the risk to their communities, what kinds of decisions might need to be made if they're facing some pretty tough consequences. I've observed increased momentum at all levels, including from mayors and chief executives locally through to the private sector, lifeline utilities, ministers, as well as parliamentarians across the spectrum, all understanding that actually New Zealand has seen repeated emergencies and that it is really important that we do take account of the lessons out of these emergencies and start to think about a future focus of how do we want to actually create and build that lasting resilience. So we're developing a national disaster resilience strategy. This builds on the back of the Sendai framework. It also is a strategy required under our Act. But the idea is that this is a way to truly galvanise action across the range of stakeholders that have a role to play. And to date, over the last year, over 600 people have been involved in that development, over 200 organisations. This is an opportunity for everyone to do their part in reaching that real vision of a resilient New Zealand. As Bruce mentioned, the changes to the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act to address recovery from our most frequent emergencies was utterly timely. We'd been working on those changes for almost 3 years, so the fact that we were able to bring forward the date for implementation, but that it had been through that really robust process, meant that it was able to be utilised in the most practical way. There's a greater sense of relationships, of team, and of the importance of leveraging off experience, expertise and investment. And I really put some of our non-traditional partners in that mix where I've certainly been very keen to build the relationship with private sector and organisations that are really wanting to show their commitment to their communities. They're wanting to show that they have that social conscience and brand and wanting to see what they can do to assist. How can they add their leverage to the work that's already going on? So for me, the opportunities that have followed the 14th of November earthquake and tsunami are just another step on the transformational journey that we are on. In any emergency, there are things that go well. There are things that need adjustment or strengthening. But what we mustn't forget is that recovery is still ongoing. There is still recovery going on post the earthquake sequence in Canterbury, post Kaikoura, post Edgecombe, and whatever the next emergency will be. The increased collaborative approach, the commitment and focus on supporting those New Zealanders impacted by this event and the other 6 emergencies we've had this year, continue to demonstrate that drive and commitment of those across the public, the private and the not-for-profit sectors to truly make a difference and to be there when our communities need us the most. I know these emergencies add pressures and often result in you having time away from your families, so I'd like to recognise the amount of hard work and commitment demonstrated by the people across all those sectors, including those of you here today that have been involved. It is truly valued and appreciated. And I know for those of our visitors overseas, you will have this in your own countries, so may I extend a big thank you to you as well. It is truly valued and appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very interesting address. Some of your comments about news media, seems we have some here, I think. On the period immediately following the earthquake, we were listening to the radio, and GNS has a series of monitoring stations throughout New Zealand for earthquakes. The disc jockey who was running the program was watching the GNS website, and it would pick up a 6 magnitude earthquake or aftershock at Kaikoura, a 5 in Wellington, shortly afterwards a 4.5 in Palmerston North, and then finally a 4 in Taupo. And there was general alarm that the whole of New Zealand was breaking up because of these earthquakes. In actual fact, it was the same aftershock being felt throughout the island. And the need for communication and the role of the media in this period of after an event like the Kaikoura, it's very important not to create public alarm. So I support your comments entirely. Now, Bruce, would you mind coming up, and are you happy to take questions? So there are microphones on the floor if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. You must have done a particularly good job.
Look, white morning tea.
Peter Wood.
I'd like to congratulate both Bruce and Sarah for an excellent presentation and the issues that you have raised, which are highly relevant to this community. I do have a question. It's come out in the media just in the last few days, and it relates to situational awareness and a comment that you made, Bruce, but you could both comment on your vision for increased instrumentation, not just of seismometers, but increased instrumentation of buildings.
I think that'd be a great question for MB, Peter. I think one of the things that we've seen throughout this is the importance of having that evidence basis, and I think if there's opportunities to do more of that, however it's done, then that's great. But I think part of the challenge is also offsetting the level of investment that is required to do that. So if it costs so much that the building owner actually can't see the economic benefit of applying it, then I think it creates some issues. So it's also whether the costs of some of these mechanisms can be brought down to make it more achievable for business owners to think about this as part of their own business continuity and their being a responsible business owner.
One of the things that we found over the last few months is there's a whole bunch of salesmen come out of the woodwork, and they want to sell you accelerometers, P-wave doodahs, and all sorts of stuff. Data is only of value if you're able to actually use it to make better decisions. I'm a person who works on intuition, and I'll make a decision based on very little data, but it's not my preferred way of doing business. And it's very uneasy doing business that way. What I've recommended is that as a result of our after-action review is that we actually expand the range of indicator buildings, not just for the city but for the region as well, because different types of quakes will manifest themselves in different ways on different sorts of buildings. So I want a greater range of indicator buildings, and I would like them pre-instrumented so that when we sit in the Emergency Operations Centre, and my good friend Dave Brunsden and a few others are sitting around me, we can actually say, look, there's a subset of buildings that we need to be very mindful of. They're this number of stories, they're in this types of soils, they're in this area here. If you can do that, then you've got a much better way of segmenting areas of risk away from the public and bringing those areas where there is no risk back into operation more quickly.
Well, thank you, and I need to bring this session to a close now. So firstly, I'd like to thank you both for speaking, and small token of appreciation.